Hello, hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. There's a really big room here. So I wanted to just thank you, welcome you. I am obviously Assemblymember Kelles. I see there's about 70 people in the room with us. I've got a couple messages from some of you who are really excited to be here, even my mother. Thank you, Mom, for being here. I wanted to just start by introducing the Vera Institute to you all and the reason for having this event. And then I will turn it to them to introduce our wonderful panel and start a presentation that they have. And then have the panelists give a few minutes each, and then we'll open it for Q&A. But the reason that I really wanted to have this conversation with you all is to talk about really what is public health, what are we seeing, and how can we all be a part of creating greater security for everyone in the community. There's been a lot of discussion about crime in New York, people seeing increases in crime, concerns about crime. That is in fact the case. There has been increases in crime over the last couple of years. We had an amazing 10-hour public hearing on Monday, though, that puts it very much in perspective. So I did want to start out with just giving a little bit of data and then introducing my friends Ben and Chantel. But for starters, what was told to us in the beginning of the presentation, the public hearing on Monday, by the Office of Court Administration and DCJS, the Department of Criminal Justice Services. The hearing was about criminal justice, criminal data that they have been collecting. And what they have found is actually rearrest rates have decreased since 2019 in New York State. And in fact, of all of the states in the country, New York State, the crime increase in New York State has been lower in the last 3 years than the average around the entire country. But there has been an increase over the last 3 years. And if we think about it, what is the one big thing that has happened in the last 3 years? That's COVID. That has happened to everyone. And if we think about what are some of the things that COVID has caused universally, have been things like economic destabilization, loss of housing, creating homelessness, increased social isolation and mental health, all things that we know are correlated with crime. So it's understandable what we're seeing. And the question is, how can we have a productive conversation about why we are seeing the trends we are seeing and how we can collectively address them and create a community that is safer? So it is also to some extent diffuse the very political conversations that have been happening about why we're seeing the crime we're seeing, particularly in the face of the data that the state presented publicly on Monday. And so that was a real impetus for wanting to have a town hall. I will note we have also had meetings with elected officials, law enforcement in both counties. So we're really trying to have this conversation collectively with all groups. But with that, to not take any more time, I want to introduce both Benjamin and Chantel from the Vera Institute. For anybody who does not know the Vera Institute, they were founded in 1961 to advocate for alternatives to money bail in New York City. But it is now a national organization that partners with impacted communities and government leaders for change. With offices in 4 major cities and a team of hundreds of advocates, researchers, and policy experts. They work to transform the criminal, legal, and immigration systems so that money doesn't determine freedom. Fewer people are incarcerated, and everyone behind bars is treated with dignity, and everyone has a safer society. So that is the foundation that they come from. I know them from many years of work at the county legislature because they have a significant number of researchers. So when I had questions about criminal justice, Vera Institute was one of the institutes that I would go to for some of the data. So that has been very helpful to step away from the emotions and look at the actual facts of the matter to help me determine how I want to move forward with policy. So with that, thank you everyone for being here. And I want to turn the floor over to our two wonderful representatives from the Vera Institute.
Thank you so much, Assemblymember. It'll just be me for now, and then I'll be joined by my colleague in a little bit. I'm in Ithaca right now and really, really pleased to be here. A team of us from the Vera Institute have been up here for a few days, going between Tompkins and Cortland counties, speaking to community members, advocates, law enforcement, the sheriff's office, to really understand more about what's happening in Cortland and Tompkins counties. So thank you virtually for having us. So I am going to share some slides and talk to you for a little bit, and then we'll have a panel discussion, and you can put questions in the Q&A function as well, and we'll be answering them throughout. So I am going to share my screen. So I hope everyone can see that, and I will get started. Right. So I first want to start by acknowledging that we at the Vera Institute and everyone we've met with the last few days, and I'm sure everyone on this call as well, believes fundamentally that all New Yorkers have the right to feel safe. And I think a lot of the heated political conversations sort of move away from that, but I think it's an important point of consensus to start with, that we all believe that New Yorkers should feel safe in their homes and communities. And what I want to talk about today, and what our panelists are going to talk about, is ways for us to achieve that safety and how we can use evidence-based solutions to make sure that all New Yorkers feel safe. But no one here, I'm sure, doesn't believe in that sort of North Star of safety, and it really is just about the details of how we get there. So I want to first start by acknowledging that safety and justice go hand in hand. I think often we're told that we have to choose between a system that delivers safety while sort of forsaking justice. So everyone feels safe, but we don't treat people with due process. We don't treat people like people, and that's the only way to feel safe. Or people think we can have a system of justice where we treat people with dignity and empathy and connect them with the services they need, but then we'll have lawlessness in the streets. And that's actually not true, right? We know from looking around New York, looking around the country, and looking around the world, that safety and justice really reinforce each other, that we have a system, if we have a system that delivers safety, it also delivers justice, and vice versa. And what people talk about when they talk about our criminal justice system often is punishment. And so I want to talk a little bit about punishment. A lot of people think about punishment as being accountability, but actually true accountability means getting that person to admit that they harmed someone and getting them to make sure that they're not going to do it again. And going to court, if you say you're guilty, the case is open and shut closed, right? So we have a system actually that doesn't incentivize people to be accountable. And punishment also doesn't really stop people from doing the same thing over again. So that's not really accountability. Punishment also is not a crime reduction strategy necessarily. So we spend over $18 billion per year in New York on police, jails, and prisons, and New Yorkers still aren't feeling safe. Safety means breaking the cycles that lead to crime in the first place and actually reducing crime, not just temporarily incapacitating people and then having the problems fester and come back. And in that same vein, punishment is also not a long-term fix, right? We send someone to jail or to prison. 99% of people who go to jail or prison get released and go back to their communities. And how we treat them during that time really matters. And so punishment is not necessarily a long-term fix because everything comes back to us. And there's no shortcut for actually fixing the root cause of those problems that lead to crime in the first place. And as I said before, so punishment, when we talk about the criminal justice system, doesn't really work. But what does work is thinking about justice and thinking about safety. And there is so much research out there about what actually creates safety for communities. And I think if we're serious about safety for all New Yorkers, we owe it to ourselves, our families, our neighborhoods, and our communities to make sure that we're looking at that research and investing our taxpayer money in solutions that will actually deliver the safety that New Yorkers want and deserve. So as I said, we have solutions. There's so much research out there, it takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. And what we know fundamentally is that there is a cycle of crime, right? People suffer from instability, they have a lack of resources, they have, some people have mental health issues, they're unhoused, they have substance use issues, they're facing economic desperation, and that leads them to do something. And then they get rearrested, they go to jail, where they can lose their homes, if they have them, their jobs, if they have them, custody of their kids, any sort of social connections that they had, all of that frays while they're in jail. Then we release them without support, and then they face even greater instability. Their mental health issues have been exacerbated, right? Their substance use issues haven't been addressed. And then the likelihood of them getting rearrested actually goes up. So research from this last year shows that even one night in jail significantly increases the likelihood that someone will be rearrested. And again, that makes sense because jail increases the instability that often leads to crime in the first place. And so we know that this cycle exists. This doesn't mean that there's absolutely no circumstance in which jail has a purpose, but it means that for most people, we need to recognize that by sending them to jail, we're actually making their situation worse in a way that lessens safety for all of us. And so what we really need to do is move away from that revolving door of people cycling in and out of arrest and jail because of root causes that aren't being addressed, and actually focus on those root causes. And so I think of it in two categories. The first is preventing crime by providing people with stable housing, access to education, mental health treatment, and substance use treatment, and other services as well, but those are the big ones. And the other is stopping cycles of violence, right? Because we know, the research tells us, and I'm sure we all just sort of intuitively know, that a lot of violence is retaliatory, that when there's one incident of violence, it ripples throughout a community and causes more violence in its wake. And if we're not doing something to interrupt that violence and to stop it, it's just going to continue and continue to escalate. So we need to leave this instability, arrest, jail, release cycle behind and move towards preventing crime before it happens and stopping cycles of violence in ways that meaningfully keep our communities safe. There are a lot of words on this slide, and I'm not going to read through all of them, but I just want to highlight some of the programs and services that some of our panelists, I'm sure, will be talking about. And what I would take away in general from all of these statistics is just that this is evidence-based, that there is so much research out there supporting what keeps communities safe and what doesn't. And as I said, the research shows that for most people, sending them to jail increases the instability they face and makes it more likely that they'll be rearrested. And all of these programs and services do just the opposite. They address the root causes that drive people to crime in the first place, and they make all of our communities safe, and they do it at a fraction of the cost of jail. So these are things like supportive housing, which is affordable housing where there are also caseworkers, mental health professionals, substance use counselors, all located in or around the housing to make it really easy for vulnerable people to access the services that they need. And research shows that it is hugely effective at reducing jail admissions and also reducing admissions to homeless shelters and to hospitals and psychiatric facilities. Education and jobs. So there was a jobs program that happened in New York City, in Buffalo, in Rochester, and a few other places around the state. And it showed that people with access to jobs were 48% more likely to have steady jobs and 20% less likely to be arrested. So by connecting people with jobs programs, we're making it more likely that they're able to earn a decent living, and that makes it significantly less likely that they'll be rearrested. Summer youth employment as well is a hugely effective way without relying on punishment, which can traumatize people and not necessarily deter them from committing the harms that we want them to stop committing. Summer youth employment without sort of resorting to punishment, just connecting young people with opportunity, again, makes it significantly less likely that a young person will be arrested. And mental health and substance use treatment as well, So many of our jails have become the de facto mental health institutions in our communities, and that's a problem. And research shows that every $1 that we invest in mental health treatment, on average, leads to $4 in public safety savings. So stopping crime before it happens, we know how to do it. We just need to put the right dollars in the right place to make it happen. And stopping escalating cycles of violence as well, right? As I said, research tells us that so much of violence is in reaction to other violence. So two programs I want to highlight. The first is community violence intervention, which is when a credible messenger, so someone from the community who maybe has been in jail or prison themselves and been involved in the criminal justice system and made it out on the other side. Community violence intervention is having those credible messengers in the community so that when there's violence, they immediately go to where the violence has occurred and they calm tension and they make sure that there's not going to be retaliation and they address the root causes of that violence to make sure that it doesn't continue. And a Brooklyn neighborhood that participated in that saw a 20% decrease in gun violence. Jail does not lead to such a steep decrease in gun violence, and so immediately. Community violence intervention is a really powerful tool. And restorative justice as well, which I always think sounds kind of high in the sky, but actually restorative justice of, meaningful dialogues and addressing the three main questions of restorative justice, which is, how have you been harmed? What do you need to feel better? And who can provide you what you need, right? So it really is advocating for victims of crime and those who've been harmed to try to help restore them and help them move forward. And those kinds of restorative justice interventions that, also bearing in mind, victims of crime often are the people who go on to commit crimes themselves. Those kinds of restorative justice programs have been associated with a 53% reduction in rearrests. There is not a jail on the planet that reduces rearrests by 53%. It is such a powerful tool. So I've talked about some of the practical solution-based or evidence-based solutions that we have to keep our communities safe. And I also want to talk a little bit about our values, right? Because our criminal justice system is really a reflection of how we think of people and vulnerable people and what we think of human nature as well. And making sure that our criminal justice system aligns with our values, I think is a really important thing for us to think about as New Yorkers. And I think we can all agree in 4 key values. The first is that we all deserve to live in safe homes and communities, which I spoke about earlier, right? Everyone here, I'm sure, believes that all New Yorkers have a right to feel safe. The second is that everyone should be treated as if they're innocent until proven guilty, right? If I get rearrested and no one's looked at the evidence yet, I want to be treated like I'm innocent until someone has a reason to say that I'm guilty. The third is that all New Yorkers should be treated equally in our criminal justice system, regardless of their access to wealth. Whether you have $1, $100, or $1 million in your bank account, you should be treated the same before the law. And the last is that access to opportunity is really the key that unlocks prosperity and safety for all of our communities, and that we owe it to ourselves and our neighbors to make sure that they have access to those opportunities. And our system needs to protect those values. And some recent changes to the legislation, and I'm talking about bail reform in 2019, were actually about these 4 values. They were about making sure that we're following the evidence for what makes people safe in their homes and communities, that we're treating New Yorkers like they're innocent until proven guilty, that we're making sure if you have $1 or $1 million that you're given the same treatment in our system. And also that people who are accused of crimes are given access to opportunities to help break that cycle of instability and get them on a better path. So bail reform really was about these 4 values. And, there have been problems with implementation, but I think fundamentally, when it comes to what bail reform actually is, it was about these values that all of us as New Yorkers hold dear. So I want to rewind a little bit and talk about what bail is. So bail is money that a person facing charges has to pay to be released while they await trial. So it's not supposed to be a punishment and to say you're guilty because it happens too early in the process. It is purely a way to make sure that someone returns to court. And if you think about bail as well, right, it can't be too much of a safety solution because people with access to wealth pay bail and leave jail immediately. So that gets back to how we treat New Yorkers and if we treat New Yorkers with wealth and without wealth equally. If we're talking about bail as a shorthand for locking someone up, well, you can pay bail and you can go home. So it's really not about incapacitating someone. It's about making sure that someone returns to court, because if you show up to court, you get your money back. And it's imposed at the very start of a case in a hearing called an arraignment, where a judge won't really review the evidence. They'll review the charges and very quickly make a decision about how likely are you to return to court based on, your living situation and your criminal history, and then make a decision about whether or not they'll set bail. And judges actually have a lot of choices when it comes to setting bail. So they can set bail for certain charges. They can remand someone for certain charges, which means just taking them into custody and they're behind bars no matter how much money they offer to pay. And then they can also release them with no conditions or release them with conditions. So they can say, you have to see a case manager, or you have to see a mental health specialist, or you have to go to substance use treatment. Or you have to, be electrically monitored. So judges have a lot of options when it comes to releasing someone while ensuring that they're being connected to the services they need to break that cycle of instability and rearrest. And so functionally, the impact of bail before we implemented the reforms was that people with money could go home. There was no impact of bail on them, right? They could pay it, they could go home, they could keep their job, their home, custody of their kids while they awaited trial. It was no different for them. And people who couldn't pay ended up behind bars. And in practice, that was mostly Black, brown, and poor New Yorkers. So there was a hugely disparate impact on our fellow New Yorkers, where predominantly Black, brown, and all poor New Yorkers who didn't have enough money in their pockets to buy their freedom were stuck behind bars. And bail, as I've said throughout, contributes to the stressors and instability that cause crime in the first place, because if you don't have money to pay bail, you probably can't afford to take time off work while you're in jail. You can't afford to lose your job or fall behind on rent payments. But not being able to afford bail means that that's what's going to happen to you. So the people who can least afford it are the people who are the most punished pre-trial. And so what the reforms in 2019 did was they eliminated the use of bail and pretrial incarceration for most low-level charges. So that's things like shoplifting. And that was important because, first of all, for repeat shoplifters who have cycled in and out of jail 9 times, putting them in jail a 10th time isn't going to help. It's not addressing the root cause of why they're shoplifting in the first place. And also, people shouldn't be paying with their freedom for something like that, right? We can connect them to services to get them on a better path that's cheaper than jail, and that's getting them out of that revolving door. So it eliminated bail and pretrial incarceration for those kinds of low-level charges. It also required judges to consider a person's financial circumstances when setting bail. And by that, I mean, again, that bail is supposed to be affordable. It's supposed to basically be a down payment that you get back when you show up to court. So just a commitment mechanism to get you to show up to court. And so when judges set $100,000 bail and you only have $100, what that means is they're basically locking you up, but they're saying it's bail. And that is really not how the law is supposed to work. It's supposed to be a commitment mechanism. So the law required judges to say, okay, you can only afford $100. So we'll take that $100 and we'll give it back to you when you show up to court. And that's a way to make sure that you show up to court. And then I really want to be clear about this last point, that it still allows judges to set bail or just incarcerate people for more serious charges, so for violent charges and for gun charges as well. So judges still have the discretion to set bail or incarcerate someone when they're accused of something violent like that. So that bit of the law actually did not change. And judges also can consider a variety of safety factors when setting bail. So if the person is charged with a gun offense, all gun allegations are bail eligible. The judge can consider someone's history of gun possession, previous criminal convictions, and whether what they're charged with includes serious harm to another person. So that's, domestic violence or other kinds of serious harm. So judges, again, have a lot of discretion to consider these safety factors when setting bail. Again, what the law was really about was making sure for low-level charges that people weren't being incarcerated in a way that inflicted harm on them, their families, and their communities while they're still presumed innocent and awaiting trial. And bail reform really has been transformative for New York. So over 95% of people released statewide were not rearrested on violent charges. Bail reform has meant that hundreds of thousands of people have been able to go home and be with their kids and their families and remain part of their communities while awaiting trial. And the vast, vast, vast majority of them, 97% of people in Tompkins County and 96% of people in Cortland County, were not rearrested on violent charges. So that means they weren't rearrested for doing something violent in the community while they were awaiting trial. And those numbers are really good. But they could be a lot better. And I think, as the Assembly member said, and as we've all experienced, people aren't feeling safe right now in New York. And we know that crime has gone up. Crime's gone up across the country, that's true, but that doesn't change the fact that crime has gone up in New York State, and crime has gone up in Tompkins and Cortland County. So we've looked at the trends. It hasn't gone up a ton, but it's gone up a little bit. And we know that should be cause for concern for people. But when we blame the wrong problems, we find the wrong solutions, right? These numbers are good, but we can do a lot better. And we need to do better by increasing funding for services that support people, right? So all of those evidence-based solutions that I spoke about earlier, housing, mental health treatment, substance use treatment, community violence intervention, restorative justice, and more beyond that. All those things, the research tells us, deliver safety, and they do so without inflicting the harms of pretrial detention on people who don't need to be in jail. I'm just going to double check. Yep, that's all I got. So thank you so much for listening. I see there are some questions in the chat, and we'll get to those. But I want to pass it first to my colleague, Julian Harris-Calvin, who will take us over to our panel. So thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions and continuing to be part of the conversation in Tompkins and Cortland County so that we can all make sure that our communities are safe for everyone. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Ben. Really appreciate that. Hello, everyone. My name is Julian Harris-Calvin, and I work with Ben and our illustrious colleague, Chantal, that the Assembly member mentioned earlier, who's really making all the tech happen. So clapping for her. So we just heard a lot about the importance of focusing on evidence-based solutions that keep our community safe by stopping crime before it happens and interrupting cycles of violence after harm occurs. And it was a lot of information. There was a lot of data. We are happy to share that presentation. So if you didn't get it down in your notes or you want to see it again without having to watch the entire recording, we are happy to share that, and you can figure out how to do that through the Assembly member's office. But next up, we are going to hear from folks here in Tompkins and Cortland counties who are actually doing the hard work on the ground and know most about what public safety looks like here, what those kinds of solutions that are evidence-based are doing to really bolster public safety and make it so that where you live here in Tompkins and Cortland counties are really flourishing communities and expanding that, that vision of public safety. So I'm just going to quickly name our panelists, and then Chantal will make sure they pop up on the screen, and I'll let them use about 30 seconds to introduce themselves. So tonight we have Reverend Nathaniel Wright from Calvary Baptist Church. We have Lisa Hoschel, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, correct me if I'm wrong, CEO of Family and Children's Society of Cortland County. We also have Derek Osborne, who is Sheriff of Tompkins County, Cindy Wilcox, who is the Executive Director of the Human Services Coalition of Tompkins County, and not least, but last, Judge Seth Peacock, who is an Ithaca County Court judge presiding over the Ithaca Wellness and Recovery Court, which is their version of a mental health court, and the DWI court. So welcome to you all. We're so happy that at the end of the week, at the end of the day, after darkness set, that you're willing to join us here and extend your work day. So with that, I think I will just ask each of you to take about 30 quick seconds for the folks that have popped in to view this. You can learn a little bit more about who you are, maybe a little bit about your background, what you do, and then we will dive right into the questions, and hopefully we'll have time for some of the questions that are in the Q&A box. So I will start with the Reverend. I can't go to church on Sunday and not say that I called on the Reverend first. And then Reverend Wright, will you just pass to someone else? Maybe you can pass to Lisa, and then we'll move on from there.
Sure. Thank you so much for the introduction and for the opportunity to be on with such great panelists. I'm humbled by the opportunity. I serve as the senior pastor at the Calvary Baptist Church in Ithaca. I've been in that position for the past 18 years and have served on several boards within community. I'm currently on working with the LEAD program and just look forward to this conversation. I believe you told me to pass it to Lisa, correct? Yes, all you.
Thank you. Lisa Herschel. I'm Executive Director and CEO at Family and Children's Counseling Services. We provide mental health and addictions counseling in 5 counties in upstate New York. We have a mobile outreach unit, 2 mobile outreach units that we are utilizing to meet people on the ground when it comes to addiction services. We have a primary prevention program, so we're working in the primary prevention program space, trying to keep folks from using illicit substances. And we've just partnered with Family Planning of South Central to provide reproductive health services. We also host the local LGBTQ resource center in our community. So we're actually the largest provider of mental health, addictions, and care coordination services in the region. We serve about 10,000 to 15,000 people a year, depending on whether or not we have COVID.
We will definitely be asking about the impact of COVID. So thank you for that, Lisa. Also, as a no longer practicing defense lawyer, I have to call on the judge next. So Judge Peacock, will you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Judge Seth Peacock, and I think I just got a promotion to county court from an introduction. I'm actually a city court judge, which is fine. We're here in Ithaca City Court, and we have 2 specialty courts. We have our newly formed, I guess I can't say newly formed, it's been in place about 3.5 years, which is our mental health court. It's called the Ithaca Wellness and Recovery Court, which I preside over. We also have a treatment court that's probably been in place over 20 years at this point. And that's presided over by Judge Wallace. We both share duties in the courts, but that's kind of the division. We're fortunate in Tompkins County that some of the options that were mentioned in the earlier presentation, we actually have here, and we have a lot of those resources. So it's a great thing for me as judge to be able to actually refer people and use some of those resources. So that's what we do here. We mainly focus on lower level charges like misdemeanor charges. And although we do handle the early stages of more serious charges, but fortunately, we are dealing with people on the lower end of the criminal scale. So it meshes perfectly with the idea that we can get those people services and try to do things to simply avoid high levels of imprisonment. But of course, at times it's necessary, and we do that as well.
Thank you. I misread my notes. It does say City Court. Apologies. I will pass it to the sheriff, and then Cindy, will you round us out before we get to the questions? Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And thanks everybody for attending, and thanks for inviting me to this event. I appreciate it. My name is Derek Osborne. I'm sheriff for Tompkins County. I started my career back in 1995 in the city of Cortland, where I joined the PD. That's where I'm originally from. Worked there 6.5 years, came to Tompkins County as a deputy in 2001. Was promoted to the ranks of investigator, senior investigator, road patrol captain, then under sheriff before retiring in 2015. And then 4 years later, I ran for sheriff myself and was elected in 2019, and I'm just starting my second 4-year term.
Is it me? Oh, is it me? Hi, I'm Cindy Wilcox. I'm the Executive Director of the Human Services Coalition of Tompkins County. Our mission is to enhance the delivery of health and human services in Tompkins County and the region. And we do that through a variety of programs and services. That includes health planning, human services planning. We are 211 information and referral. We are this continuum of care, which is the COC, our homeless response, community-wide homeless response system, network. We do capacity building and leadership development for organizations and boards. So we are many things to many people. So we're kind of like the go-to for not-for-profits in Tompkins County. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Vera Institute, and thank you, Assemblymember Kelles, for inviting me. Appreciate it.
Thank you all. So we have some very specific questions, but I think one that I will ask as an open question to any of you that want to dive in and answer is, what, if you could talk about briefly about what you believe are the causes of crime, why, for instance, judge people come before you, or sheriff come before you, or any of you really, and then Rev, it could be about what you see as a spiritual leader in the community. I'm sure talk to grieving mothers of victims. But at the end of the day, when you think about what causes crime, particularly in the communities you serve, what is that, and how you think we should address it? And I will let whichever of you wants to pop in. Or I can cold call. Take it back to when I was in law school.
That's fine. This is Judge Peacock.
Okay.
I was having trouble unmuting myself there. I think that's a relatively complicated question. And what I'll say is generally what I find in a lot of crimes that come before me is a general disconnect from society, or feeling that they're not invested, or there's no real part in them for this. So going outside of kind of the normal approved behavior is almost okay, because there's no real investment or connection to folks. And sometimes I notice that when there's that lack of connection, it's easier to perpetrate a crime against people that you don't have a connection to. Of course, obviously, in addition to that lack of connection, there's the issues related to being intoxicated, or that releases your inner aggression and allows you to do things you might not normally do. In addition, of course, there's the issue with drugs and alcohol and the type of behaviors that you need to do when you're seeking those. So those are some of the things I noticed, but that disconnect from your fellow citizen is an important part of that. And but I'd love to hear what other people think as well.
If I could say, I think we're dealing with, to follow along that vein of interaction and attachment, we're right now experiencing a significant, I would say, pandemic, and it's not COVID, it's despair amongst our residents. We don't provide adequate housing opportunities. People are living in poverty with very limited access to health care. And we talk a lot about mental health treatment and its impact on all of the statistical sort of markers of a healthy society. We are not engaging there. We are waiting until people are incarcerated before we provide them treatment. We have been trying to provide services in every school building in Cortland County when it comes to mental health counseling, as well as most of the buildings in Broome County. And I will tell you, we've seen a 350 to 400% increase in the severity of need in the school buildings when it comes to mental health. That's a huge increase over the past 3 years. And that started before COVID. COVID just brought it to the forefront. We always talk about the value of mental health treatment and adjacent addictions supports, but we don't pay for it. And as a result, this is a group of people who feel undervalued, underutilized, and lost in a sea of despair that is palpable. It's palpable. We have had the number of children trying to commit suicide today is getting younger and younger and more violent. And these are, for example, we had a 5-year-old who actually with intent attempted suicide, a 5-year-old. These are kids who are the victims of trauma, that are the children of adults who are victims of trauma. And we just think they should get over it. It's at, in my view, the root of everything.
Yeah, that was really powerful.
Thank you,
Lisa. We're going
Lisa.
to dig in a little more about that too. I think it's just coming on the back of what Lisa said, Cindy, it'd be great to hear from you as someone who, sees the need for a lot of these services. I'm sure have the same experiences of people who come through your door.
Sure. Yes to all of those things. And I guess I'm inspired by Reverend Wright. I'm gonna, I don't know if you all know the parable of the river, right? Where the babies are being pulled out of the river, and everyone's like, what are all these babies in the river? And what's happening upstream is really is where we need to fix the problem, right? So pulling the babies out of the river is not going to stop the babies from falling into the river. So why are they falling into the river? So, to Lisa and Seth's point, it really is about, kind of prevention. And I do think, kind of public, when we think about public safety, like I think about personal safety. And if we as a community are going to be, safe, and we all have, health and well-being, safety is a condition of like being protected from harm. Harm looks very different for different people. Depending on your socioeconomic status and whether you have a place to live and whether you're experiencing structural racism and discrimination, and whether you're hungry, whether you are using substances. So, I think it's really a lot of times individualized, and, in health and human services, that is the business that we are in, is kind of helping support folks in their individual needs and making sure that's trauma informed and specific and evidence-based. I agree with Judge Peacock. It's a complicated question to answer, but I do think there is definitely evidence around how to mitigate some of that. And I think that some of the programs and services that we provide here in Tompkins County are really working on that intentionally, and trying to tackle that question.
Yeah, thank you for that. Two things that you and Cindy and Judge talked about, I think, is really just the psycho-emotional needs of folks being the root cause. And I'm looking at you, Rev, through the virtual world. Really, that's really intertwined with spiritual needs. And so I know that a lot of people are suffering with this. I'm sure you counsel those folks, their family members who are looking for support for folks who are struggling, like the family of that 5-year-old. I can't even imagine, Lisa. And then I'm going to get to you, Sheriff, because your job is public safety. That is your mandate. So I haven't forgotten about you. But that felt like a good segue to the Rev, and then I'll pass that big, broad, complex question to big, broad, complex issues to you, Sheriff, after Reverend Wright.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that has been said. As complex as it is, one of the things that we continue to see is the need to invest in people, right? And of all ages, in all walks of life. I think while the causes of crime are complex, the remedies aren't necessarily as complex, right? I think one of the things the presentation pointed out is the more in the unstable someone's life and circumstances are, the more likely they are to be involved in criminal activity. Over the past, just this past week, actually, our church was broken into, and some things were taken. And my child reminded me, I have a 14-year-old who reminded me, you never know what someone is going through. As frustrated as I was about, just the violation of it all. And he just reminded me, imagine how desperate they had to be in order for the church to be the space. And so, we often talk about, and I think Judge Peacock made an amazing point, kind of the lack of community, and certainly a lack of connection. And one of the areas that one of the blessings and benefits of Tompkins County is that there are a whole lot of agencies, a whole lot of spaces where people can go to develop community and develop connection. It's amazing to be able, we're big enough and small enough to actually get public safety right. And so when you can go to Wegmans and see the judge picking out produce, it's a little bit different than just having someone that is far away. So building community is a little bit easier.
Awesome. Sheriff, how are you going to fix it?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and you may also see me at Wegmans, but I have to admit I'm probably not picking out as much produce as I should. But that's on me. But yeah, I mean, I agree with what everybody is saying here, and I come from a history of 24 years in law enforcement and working the hard cases and seeing a lot of victimization and crime and having to deal with victims and not just the defendant. So I can see some of the arguments that Vera may get, or people, when it comes to talking about things like this, especially when it's coming from a law enforcement perspective, because you're dealing with officers that have seen horrific acts committed and had to somehow seek justice for the victims involved. But, as time goes on and you learn more about the criminal justice system and you move up through the ranks, and there's clearly a responsibility that needs to be had on the front end of arrest, and that's why we're here tonight, and on the back end as well. Having personal experience running a jail, I know that inmates that are currently housed at my facility, no doubt have severe drug addiction issues. They're suffering economically, and they have, most of them, mental health issues or a combination of all three. So yeah, I think we're being irresponsible if we're not trying to correct these issues before arrest happens. And unfortunately, if an arrest does happen, what are we doing to fix that on the back end? And that's really where the challenge is. My scope is somewhat limited. I have inmates in the jail for a very short time. We don't always have the most time to work with them, although we do offer many programs. Typically, somebody is not in the jail longer than a year, although that can happen under certain circumstances. So we got a very short window to get them help, and I do see people coming in suffering pretty severely, and once we can get them fed and get them clothed and warm and off the drugs and removed from some of the negative influences, at least for a temporary basis, I see quite a dramatic change in the way they present themselves. But again, they leave our jail, and if there's not much there to keep them going when they get out, we're right back in the same boat, and the arrest cycle starts again, like you said. So this is a very difficult conversation, and it has a lot of nuances to it. And not a lot of easy answers, like the judge said.
I do want to just add really quickly some of the statistics just to support what Sheriff Osborne just said. The data shows about over 60% of people leaving prison go into homeless shelters, become directly homeless. So if they don't go into a shelter, they go directly into the street. There have been, I've had a lot of conversations with what happens with children that are in youth detention facilities and come out still as youth. They go back to the same families where they were traumatized, And in some cases where they found their circle were in gangs, that created at least some protection. So it creates a cycle of not able to leave that environment. So one of the things that I did want to talk about and bring it back to with what Chantel spoke about and Ben spoke about is that this is a conversation about how to reduce crime in the first place and how to do prevention. And there's some really important questions that people have posed. And the question is, how do we address those? What is the cause? For example, Sarah Kraft made a really good point. My 15 and 16-year-old daughters are afraid to walk on the commons and other areas of town. Our children have a right to feel safe in public spaces without fear of being catcalled and harassed. I'd love to see some larger action taking regarding that issue. And I absolutely agree that people should be able to walk in public spaces without feeling harassed and feeling safe. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, why is that action happening? What is going on? And what we do find is because we are seeing such increase in trauma and drama, because we are seeing such increases in mental health, because we are seeing such cases of homelessness, that trauma leads to outbursts. And what we are, the discussion we are having is, we have a set amount of funds as a town, as a county, as a state, as a federal government. Where are we investing? Are we investing in the causes, the things that would reduce the causes that lead to people feeling unsafe? That is what is really important, and that we have on a discussion of data and facts. And what we do find is programs like the community outreach worker program that we do have in Ithaca was highly successful in reducing some of those reactions, some of those interactions on the commons. So the question is, are we investing in those programs enough? If they are where we are finding true solutions. If in fact the revolving in and out of prison with insufficient programming and the subsequent continued destabilization actually exacerbates the very crime and reduces the very public safety that we are trying to create for everybody. So that's where we're coming from, is what is it? Asking ourselves, what is it that would create the safety we truly want?
So I think people need to realize two things from a local, just from a general perspective. Individuals who have been engaging in drug use for a very long time oftentimes have created an environment within their own brains where they really do continue to need access to their drug of choice. We are seeing, for example, an extremely aggressive move towards, once again, methamphetamines in our community in Cortland County. All the funding is going to opiates. That's not the largest killer in our community. The largest killer in terms of addiction is actually alcohol. We can't now really address the alcohol issue or the methamphetamine issue because all our money is going to opiates. But in the meanwhile, one must remember that oftentimes many of these drugs create permanent changes in the brain that make individuals much less likely to be able to make effective and appropriate choices. It's a medical change, that physically, a genetic change that occurs in their brains. So to have people say, as often is said in our circle, why can't they just stop? It becomes no longer an option after years, decades of use. So I think that we need to create solutions, especially in the substance use world, where we all have leeway, where we have the ability to use evidence-based practices to come to the best individual solutions for each individual that's engaging in these behaviors. The other is from a statewide policy perspective. A lot of our tax dollars we think is going to healthcare or Medicaid, when a very large portion of our funding is actually going to consultants who are helping hospitals figure out how to leverage every dollar out of the taxpayer in order to create hoards of cash in their in their safes. We haven't really created a system of healthcare where many of these issues could be addressed effectively. And instead, what we're seeing is this massive transfer of assets from the taxpayer into the coffers of private individuals who own stocks in healthcare organizations or into managed care companies that are really the ones that make the determinations as to what's covered and what's not in our community. And when we do base mental health and addiction service within the healthcare arena, that's a real concern for me. I know a large portion of my dollars, and Cindy, I'm sure you could speak to that as well, a large proportion of the tax dollars that are going into the system are being utilized for profit. And that's why we can't pay for the programs we need to pay for on the ground.
There's a lot to unpack there. So I think I'll pick a couple pieces. One question for Cindy, just to follow up on, you guys are a good pair. Following up on one point from Lisa, is okay, what kinds of services do exist to kind of address exactly what Lisa was talking about here locally, and how did COVID and the shutdown of what services did exist, which there are never enough services, but there was a long shutdown that coincided with a rise in despair, a rise in suicide, a rise in crime and violence and trauma, and it's just a rise in all of the things we're talking about that are root causes. It'd be great to hear kind of how COVID affected the services that people needed, and then how you're, and I know you are, just bouncing back from that. That would be, I think, helpful, just context setting for some folks, given just the world we live in today.
Yes. So how did COVID is still affecting us, right? We are still, kind of feeling the impact of COVID. I mean, it's kind of like a global trauma, right? Like with every trauma, I don't necessarily think that we have fully realized the impact on our communities. I mean, we know that there's some very clear impacts, which are things like, the social isolation piece and how that's impacting public safety, housing instability, workforce issues, unemployment, all of those things. It's interesting because in the health and human services sector, we weren't able to sit in our PJs and binge Netflix during COVID. Not only did we not stop, programs and services, we elevated, and went 100 miles an hour instead of the regular miles an hour that we do, which is kind of close to 100. So, that demand for services just increased. We, in the county are seeing, some of that demand decrease, but not really. It's kind of remaining kind of a steady state. And it is exacerbated too with our workforce issues as well. So, our workforce kind of was decimated during COVID, and we're kind of building that back. So I think the good thing, this COVID silver linings for us, at least in Tompkins County, not only did we stay in it, but we got in it together more than we had before. Collaborations, partnerships, those really strengthened in a lot of areas. Assemblymember Kelles mentioned the community outreach program. We expanded during COVID. We created a street outreach team, and I saw a couple of names on the list here of who's here. There are a couple of members of that street outreach team. They came together during COVID to assist folks that were unhoused and in the encampments and a whole bunch of other things. But they have stayed together, and they are making an impact, and we are working much closer together as a community and trying to kind of collaborate and pool our resources a little more. So, and we see pockets of that, and we see the kind of collective impact of those partnerships. Mental health is another example. You know, I remember before COVID, you know, we talked about like telehealth, for example. I'm like, it's going to take at least 2 years to get telehealth happening. Well, I think we did it in like 3 weeks.
We did it in 24 hours.
There you go. Right. So another silver lining, I think, and kind of the bouncing back piece is we have demonstrated that we are a resilient sector, and we can pivot, and we can kind of move our services and programs to be more agile, to meet the needs of the day. To Lisa's point, that does take a lot of investment. It takes a lot of financial investment. It takes a lot of human resource investment. It's sometimes not cheap on the front end, right? But the return on that investment, like Sheriff Osborne was talking about, is large. So I do agree with Assemblymember Kelles in that kind of what are we investing in. I do want to say also from an investment perspective, Tompkins County, the legislature actually invested over $6 million in one-time grant money to community organization as part of their recovery fund. 3/4 of that money went to health and human services organizations to address these specific issues around housing and food and employment and mental health and substance use and crisis stabilization. Those partnerships that kind of started in COVID and are continuing are really making an impact on on the services we are able to provide. We still have a long way to go, but I do think that foundationally, we're able to move forward as an organization, at least around some of those shared community system-wide goals. So I'm hopeful.
I'm just gonna, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I just want to jump in. I know we have a lot of questions piling up, and give everybody a chance to give their input on some of these questions. I do want to just acknowledge a few important questions that have come up, and then I want to circle back around to some of the other panelists to give their input. Specifically, I did want to point out, unfortunately, my partner in crime in criminal justice reform, who I work with very closely in Albany, who I was hoping could join us, who was a person formerly incarcerated, I was not able to, and I'm hoping to do a follow-up town hall with some people who have been formerly incarcerated as a focus. So stay tuned, because there's some amazing people who are doing amazing work throughout the state. One of the other things that I did want to make the distinction, there is a question about feeling unsafe, and then the difference of different groups substantially being unsafe in this environment. And those are distinct. And I want to make that point and acknowledge that that Black and Brown people in this community are targeted significantly more by law enforcement. We do know this. They are much less likely to get selected for jobs simply by their name, even if it's on a resume. They're less likely to get opportunities in education, for internships, for movement up. There are so many cases of structural discrimination. So when you talk about lived experience of feeling unsafe, and being unsafe, I do want to acknowledge that that is fundamental. And that is also partly why we're talking about, when we see generational incarceration, we talk about generational poverty and generational trauma. There's also generational incarceration, where you have trauma leading to incarceration, leading to trauma, all coming from continuous existence in a fundamental system designed to target and disadvantage and traumatize Black and Brown people within our community. And that leads to what we see, which is this generational incarceration. So I do want to make that point very, very clear. And again, distinguish between yes, it is important to acknowledge people's feelings of being unsafe while simultaneously acknowledging the disparity in the existence in our society, differential existence of not being safe. So I did just want to make that distinction.
Thank you for that, Assemblymember. I think there is a lot in the chat. I'm trying to keep up and also listen to all of you and your great answers. And I think there's one note that Ben wanted me to mention too, in terms of just the racial disparity between how people experience public safety and feelings of safety, their people's perceptions around safety, crime and safety, and the structures that are supposedly put in place to keep us feel safe. And one of the reasons, Ben mentioned bail reform earlier, but one of the things that we always want to mention is part of the reason bail reform was passed was because it was meant to address specifically the racial inequity in our pretrial incarcerated population, because Black and Brown folks were incarcerated pretrial at higher rates than their white counterparts. Poor New Yorkers of every race and creed were also incarcerated more than their wealthier counterparts, even if you were looking at the same criminal record, the same allegations, you know, apples to apples. And so that was one of the reasons why bail reform was passed in 2019. But I think that brings me to you, Judge, because I think we've talked a lot about some of the reasons why people get come before you and your colleagues at the court is because of these root causes that we've talked about, right? And so, you know, we've all said today, and even the sheriff has said, like, there's only so much you can do at the jail for folks who have mental health issues, substance use issues, poverty-related issues, trauma-related issues, all of the things we talked about, despair, suicidal ideation. And so for you, when someone comes before you, I guess the question is, what are the options that you have when you have someone come before you in the pretrial process? And what do you wish you had when someone comes before you in the pretrial process?
Wow. So I have a wish list here, but I first want to say, in this role, part of what I do is I have to balance this idea of accountability. And, you know, you as an individual being accountable for your behavior and with the understanding that you came from, you know, perhaps an unfair situation or you know, a less than ideal, but there is the kind of obvious sense that in this role as judge, I'm, you know, part of a coercive system. And what I try and do in this role is yes, it's part of a coercive system, but, you know, maybe balance that coercive nature of the judicial system with the opportunities that you know, I'm lucky to have in Tompkins County with the resources here. So oftentimes, you know, well, the first thing I try and do is see everybody who comes before me. And it's a simple thing. You know, everyone who comes before me, I simply say good morning. And I usually say, thanks for coming in today. Now, obviously, they don't want to be there, but it's just a normal human greeting. And as Reverend said, you know, I try to see people in the community. I try to be seen. So it just builds a normal connection to folks. But, you know, I'm lucky here in that when I want to hold someone accountable for their behavior, I can say, listen, you know, obviously I have this jail opportunity here. And that's something I can always use, but hey, I need you to go to mental health. I need you to go down to cars and work on your drug addiction or alcohol addiction. I need you to meet with this housing person, right? So in a lot of ways, I'm using that coercive, yes, jail's, you know, always in my back pocket. But when I say I need you to go someplace, it has a little bit of authority and they might not even be motivated to do it for a good reason. They might be motivated to do it because the alternative is something bad. But at the same time, I also try and build hope and see them as a person and say, what are you trying to be? I often ask people, like, who are you trying to be at this point? You know, is this the person you're trying to be? You're 35 years old, you're not being the father you want to be, you're not being, so it's just a real combination. But like I said before, I'm lucky. I have a housing specialist in mental health court. I have substance abuse specialists. I have mental health people that can actually see people. They're not on a 6-month waiting list. I have job training. I have educational opportunities with TC3 and the CIU program, which is College Initiative Upstate. It gets folks, money and resources to succeed. I have case management. I have case managers who can help people develop the normal skills that we might have of cleaning your house, getting up in the morning, making appointments. And then we also have social engagement. I often encourage people to go over to the mental health building, and they have food there. We have the Mental Health Association. They have coffee, just the kind of normal things. I ask people what their hobbies are, just outside of just staying sober. Hey, what are you trying to do? What do you like to do? So there's a lot of things I try and do, but also, listen, I'm going to hold you accountable for this, right? In a way that I see you as a human. But listen, we have these resources here. You better take advantage of those, because we have this coercive option here. And I hope you make that choice, and I hope you stay focused. But that coercive option and balancing that is difficult, but it is part of the accountability and the role that I'm in. So, but yeah, those are a lot of my resources, and I forgot to mention probation. Oftentimes people think probation is simply a punitive, and it can be that, but my experience with a lot of the probation officers in Tompkins County is these are champions, cheerleaders. They help people through addiction. They're not just quick to file violations. They really work with people. So we have a good situation, and I'm fortunate to be judge here.
There's a bunch of questions to get to, but I did actually want to reach out specifically to you, Reverend Wright. In your experience in the environment, the faith community is a place where people can feel safe and really share, what they're experiencing and how they are working through some of the increases in crime and safety, and the needs that people are needing that they're not seeing met, services. What are you hearing, and how are you working with the community, and what do you see that is really needed in the community?
Sure. Thank you, Assemblymember. One of the things that has occurred during pandemic is an increase in every request, right? And so whether that is counseling or crisis intervention or crisis stabilization, it has caused many faith-based organizations to really examine how we operate and allocate resources, right? Because it is still certainly a matter of, all right, what do we choose to fund and where? From a victim standpoint, many folks simply want to know how not to have feelings of being unsafe, how not to become bitter, how not to become angry, right? And so we go through a lot of two of my favorite quotes when it comes to justice. One is from Thomas Aquinas, who says, "Justice without mercy is cruelty, but mercy without justice is dissolution." And that a bell hooks quote that says, justice is to have a moral universe, not only to know what's right and wrong, but to put things in perspective, to weigh things. Justice is different from violence and retribution. It requires complex accounting, right? That it is to seek from a victim standpoint to understand what is happening within community, to know that there are people who are struggling with mental health, who are struggling with life stability from a perpetrator, for lack of a better term, standpoint. One of the things that Sheriff Osborne has been great about, I've been to the jail many times just to meet with and deal with folks who may be in there who are dealing with crisis, and kind of to Judge Peacock's point, to figure out what kind of person are you trying to be, and how do you play, and how do you see yourself as a vibrant part of community. I don't think that people want to be outsiders, right? They do not want to be. They want to feel a part of something, and so we have struggled. I think faith-based organizations are struggling to figure out how do we create community for folks. And one of the interesting things that we're going to try to do over the 2023 is to try to be a bridge between victims and perpetrators, to try to figure out how do we get this reconciliation done in a way that is productive, whether or not it is someone, whether it is direct victim or someone who is just a perpetrator of an offense, who just wants to be forgiven later on, right? Who is just trying to figure out how to get to a redemption space. And so to allow folks not to become unconnected because they've been a victim of a crime, but also to reincorporate someone who's coming back from jail or coming back from prison.
That's really powerful. Thank you so much.
Yes, you're giving us a word on a Thursday night, Rev. It's not Sunday yet. Assemblymember, did you have one more thing, or can I?
No, I'm handing it back to you.
One up. Okay, great. So Sheriff Reverend Wright just talked about the fact that he and folks in his community are able to come in and give spiritual guidance and therapeutic services to folks at your jail where you work. Can you tell us a little bit about what other kinds of programming for the folks who do end up in your custody, other kinds of programming that is available to folks while they're there?
Yeah, certainly. And I can speak on both sides of the house, the law enforcement side and the corrections side. You know, a lot of the reimagination work that I'm most proud of, that I think has and will have a great impact on our community, started with us trying to develop ideas in ways we can provide non-law enforcement response to certain types of call types that typically come into the sheriff's office. We instituted, as many people may know, a sheriff clerk pilot program where we have people assigned to handle a lot of calls over the telephone, which frees up both our road patrol resources, but also prevents the need to send an armed deputy to this call type, or whatever that is. There's quite a few. That has proved to be very successful. And I can speak again, when that idea was first floated by law enforcement members in my office, they were very hesitant. That was a big change. And if you know anything about police, they don't like change. And it's turned out to be a very successful program, and people are seeing the benefits all around. We also are working now with mental health to try to pilot and start a co-response mental health program where we respond with one deputy and one social worker to try to interact with people on a more, I don't know how to word it, but a more a less authoritative type response, unmarked car, less looking uniform for the deputy assigned to that program. And it gives us the best of both worlds, where we can have an opportunity to help somebody with their needs, but also provide security at the same time. So that's going to be interesting to see how that rolls out, hopefully this year in the springtime. And on the jail side of the house, you know, we do have various programs. Most of them are run by outside entities and groups that come in and do that stuff for us. We try to get them set up with some educational opportunities as far as GEDs. We have a teacher that comes in and teaches that stuff. And that's always nice to see when somebody passes a test while they're in the jail, and it gives them something to be proud of. And I think they leave a little bit better for that. We also have been a big proponent of the MAP program, working again with the mental health department. We got grant funding through OASIS to do medically assisted treatment to help people get off their addiction. And I think we were probably one of the first counties and county jails that were really doing that effectively before everybody else started signing on. We also created an opportunity for telemed services through Reach Medical. That gives inmates an opportunity to get their medical needs taken care of, but then also have a contact when they get out of the jail to follow up with that. So I'm also interested to see how that goes on down the road. We also, every inmate that gets out, if they need an ID and they don't have one, we'll give them a sheriff's ID. You wouldn't believe the impact that has on somebody's life when they have no proof of ID. They think those sheriff IDs are very helpful. But we're also sending them out with Narcan, fentanyl test strips, and other toiletries, socks, winter hats, and things just in like a go bag when they go, just to hopefully ease their worries a little bit when they leave. There's still a lot of room for improvement, no doubt.
Thank you so much, Sheriff.
Yeah, that was quite a bit.
Please
go ahead.
go. No. I just wanted to note, Celia, you had your question about the stats on crime between Cortland and Tompkins, and if different in community approach to public safety, what are some of them? I'm going to follow up with you on those stats. I will have to look those up in the data we have. I don't have them right in front of me. So I will follow up. The other thing I did want to note, I will put some of the resources that people have shared in the Q&A, as well as these slides in my newsletter. I usually do a weekly newsletter. I will put these in my next newsletter. So if you go to my New York Assembly page, if you just type in Anna Kelles, NY Assembly, my page will come up, and just click newsletter and you can sign up for that and I will share them. You can subscribe, unsubscribe, whenever, however you want. So I did want to read just one resource that was shared with us. As you recall, I did bring up earlier today or earlier this evening about the community outreach worker program. And actually, I can't seem to find it right this instant. But yes, from Natalia. She gave phone numbers and contact information. There are 2 community outreach workers in the city. There are 2 in the rural area. Since I left the county, it seems that has been even expanded to an outreach van, which is phenomenal. There are not many communities in upstate New York that have that. So I will share those resources as well as in my newsletter. So thank you so much, Natalia.
And Chantal will drop that URL for you to sign up for the newsletter so that you can get all those resources from the Assembly member. And we are 1 minute away from 7:30, which I think is our ending time. So I think I will pass it one more time back to you, Assembly member. But before I do that, so before you close us out, I just want to thank all of you for joining today. We know your time is super valuable. Your expertise on this panel has been incredibly valuable for us as researchers and folks who really work and have dedicated our professional lives to doing criminal justice work, criminal justice reform. I hope the folks who have been watching feel the same way. I'm sure they do. I am grateful to you, Assembly member, for inviting us here, coordinating all of this. And with that, I will pass it back to you, Assembly member. Thank you so much for having us.
Absolutely. I too want to thank everyone for being here. As my constituents know, I've been deeply involved in criminal justice reform work over the last 8 years, and even more so at the state level, and have every day a greater and greater determination to address the root causes of crime. And that is really why I wanted to bring people here today, because we can do, sort of things that make us feel better, shout and scream about things that may make us feel better in an instant. But what I care about is making people feel safe. And that is going to require continued, real, increasing investments in the things that everybody here on this panel talked about this evening. We're having a discussion, right now we just started the budget, There's a proposal to put another $1 billion specifically into mental health. We'll see exactly where that goes. We need to make sure that it goes to the community services, to the right places. Some of the things that we've been hearing is there are just simply not enough case managers. There are not enough mental health workers in schools, in senior centers, in supportive housing, in all locations. I've had great conversations with Lisa Hoschel about this. I will be continuing to fight for her and her work and the work with people with substance use disorders. So we have a lot of work to do, but this conversation was about where we need to put that work to make real change. That was really the point of this conversation. And I want to thank every single person on this panel for bringing your heart, your big hearts, and your brilliance to this conversation. And thank you for the work that you do every day to continue to fight the good fight for our community safety. So for everyone who stayed with us for this whole time, my appreciation. Hopefully this was helpful, and let's continue the conversation from here on.